The NFL schedule will be revealed tonight. What should Jets fans be hoping for? I'll offer my thoughts on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, May 12th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. I thank you for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to subscribers to this show, and to join that group, just hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. The NFL schedule will be released tonight. NFL Network is having a 3-hour special to unveil the 2022 NFL schedule. I'm not making this up. They are doing a 3-hour show tonight on the NFL schedule. You know, the NFL has done a magnificent job of monopolizing the calendar. It used to be the NFL was really only the focus in the fall and the early winter. And over the course of, as the years have progressed, they've figured out how to take over the spring with making free agency such an event and the combine and all the draft-related stuff leading up to the draft. The NFL still has not figured out a way to draw attention in the period between May and July, August, when training camps open up. And the fact that they are putting so much hype into the schedule release shows you they're out of ideas. I mean, I'm sorry, if you're watching that show tonight, find something better to do. You can check on your phone. That's what I'm doing. I'll check on my phone when it comes out. But 3 hours to release the schedule. I've always said this is the most overhyped day of the year. And this is like a perfect example. Why is it overhyped? Well, first of all, we already know who the Jets are playing. We know all 17 games. This is not, you will receive no new information today on the opponents the Jets will be playing. These have been known well in advance. And in fact, you know almost all of the Jets' opponents from now until the end of time. There are only a couple of games that are variable every year, but like almost all of the games are already known in advance. But we've known all 17 games since the end of the season. We've known who the 8 teams the Jets will play at home. We've known the 9 teams the Jets will play on the road. And why did the Jets in 17 games have 9 road games this year? Well, last year, AFC teams got 9 home games. This year, NFC teams get 9 home games. That's how they kind of balance out the fact that with a 17-game schedule, you're going to have an uneven assortment of home and road games. So we are not really revealing any new information tonight. We're revealing the new information that's being revealed is when the games are starting and when they will be played. And I'm not saying that there's zero relevant information that will come out tonight, but I'm saying it's ridiculously overhyped. And a 3-hour, I mean, you got baseball. You got the NBA playoffs tonight. You got the Stanley Cup playoffs. You know what? If football's your only sport, there's something better you could do with your night than watching this ridiculous show. And here's the other thing. Through the day, the schedule is going to be leaked. I mean, every year, like we know most of the games by the time the schedule is released. Sometimes we know all the Jets games before this NFL Network fiasco tonight. I can't get it's like an annual tradition that the famous radio host from the former WFAN host, Mike Francesa, always leaks the Giants schedule, and he always figures out a way to get the Giants schedule in advance. A 3-hour show. The NFL's got to have a better way to try and figure out a way to like generate the buzz in May. 3 hours. And this is the other aspect of this. We don't really know who the good teams are going to be and who the bad teams are going to be. And that's what makes it tricky, because every year, like, there's about, like, half the playoff teams are new. You know, half the teams that made the playoffs last year don't make it this year. And that's because in the NFL, most of the teams are pretty close in talent level, and you only play 17 games. So over the course of a short season, there can be random different, the difference between a 10-7 team and a 7-10 team could be, a couple of lucky bounces, a call or two, a bad break or two. So, we don't really know who the good teams are. At the very top, you have teams like Kansas City, who, you can probably guess Kansas City is going to be good. And at the very bottom, you can figure out who the worst teams in the league are going to be typically. But in the middle, it's very difficult to say who's going to be really good and who's not going to be really good. So all of the analysis of, oh, this is the easy stretch of the schedule, this is the tough stretch of the schedule. Well, last year, I'm sure when the schedule came out last year, we were all looking at Cincinnati as a very winnable game. They ended up going to the Super Bowl, and the Jets beat them. So even like the games that like look really hard on paper, you can still win. So, I mean, I look at the Jets' opponents. You have 17 opponents. Of course, they play the AFC teams twice, so it's not really 17. But, I mean, look at these opponents. Okay, I would guess Buffalo's going to be good. I feel pretty confident Buffalo's... But then again, sometimes somebody gets hurt. So maybe Josh Allen gets hurt. So, I mean, Buffalo's like the one I feel most confident in. At the bottom of the league, okay, I feel pretty confident Seattle's going to be really bad, and the Jets have a trip out there. At some points, they have a trip. They'll be traveling to Seattle because they traded Russell Wilson, and I guess we're going to get either Geno Smith or Drew Lock. So that seems like a very winnable game on paper. Outside of that, I mean, I think it's tough to say which of these teams are going to be good and which are going to be bad. New England, I mean, with Belichick, you would assume they'd be good, but we don't know. They kind of finished last year not that great. How much staying power will Mac Jones have? That's an open question. The Bengals, of course, almost won the Super Bowl last year, so they could be a juggernaut this year. At the same time, we've seen it in the past. Sometimes teams struggle after losing the Super Bowl. Sometimes teams take a step back. Even if they're building something special for the long run, sometimes you have a year where things just don't click after you lose a Super Bowl. Baltimore, they could be a bounce-back candidate, but, who knows? They missed the playoffs last year. I mean, you have some wild card teams in here. You've got Miami, Jacksonville. I mean, who knows what to expect from them? Pittsburgh could have a rookie quarterback. Cleveland, there's a lot out there. We don't know. I mean, I guess Green Bay we can expect would be good if Aaron Rodgers is healthy. Maybe Denver we can expect would be good with Russell Wilson and, a team that's got talent on paper. But, I mean, is Minnesota going to be good? Cleveland, there's a lot up in the air in Cleveland. So, it's very easy to, like, look at the schedule and say, oh, this is the easy game. This is the hard game. But we don't know. And again, even, like, sometimes let's say you predicted Cincinnati was going to be much better heading into last season. The Jets still beat them. So I think a lot of the schedule analysis is, kind of silly. I think there's not a lot to talk about right now. So people tell you, like, what are the easy games? What are the tough games? And it almost never, like, actually turns out that way once we get to the season. So I'm not a big fan of the over-analysis, but there are some things to discuss. I do think that there are certain things I look for when the Jets schedule comes out every year that could marginally make a difference. And listen, at the end of the day, whether you're a good team or a bad team is going to be determined much more by your talent level. And frankly, it's going to be much more determined by luck. And I think sometimes we underestimate the role luck plays in determining who's good and who's bad, because about half of NFL games are decided by one score or less. And when a game's decided by one score or less, sometimes, it's determined by a fluky play. Sometimes a blown call can change a game. Sometimes, a guy fumbling can change a game. Like a bounce of the ball on a fumble can change a game. But that's determined. These are the things that determine your outcome of the season much more than the schedule order, much more than, whether you're playing Sunday at 1 or Monday night, or, whether you're playing this team week 2 or week 4. That stuff doesn't make that big of a difference. But again, I do think that there are some things to look for and let's be honest, as the schedule leaks through the day, because this 3-hour fiasco is going to be completely irrelevant by the time it airs. I still can't believe 3 hours. Are you joking me? I probably should. I'm not watching. Why should I care? But 3 hours. 3 hours to tell you the schedule of games you already knew were being played. That's what we're doing today at the NFL. But as I said, there are things I think are worth watching, and I'll discuss some of them as we continue here on this Thursday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, this offseason, Joe Douglas has tried to fix the Jets. Listen, I got no idea how you fix this 3-hour schedule show tonight, but if you need to fix your car or truck, that's something I can help you with. You should know this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto, and with the ever-increasing number of makes and models, it's impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need, and you have to endure that pointless or intimidating questioning, and you have to wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, and they're ordering the only brand their warehouse carries. Well, you have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. So go to rockauto.com. You'll save time and money when you use them. It's a family business. They've been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and their prices are reliably low for every customer. And they won't force you to watch the 3-hour NFL schedule special on NFL Network. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in there, how did you hear about this box, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or your first watch every day. We're free and available on all platforms. I gotta tell you, I could go on all day about this ridiculous 3-hour special, but let's move on. Let's talk about some of the things that I think actually could make a difference marginally for the Jets in 2022 as the schedule is released. And the schedule matters. Listen, if you have an easy schedule, your path to the playoffs is much easier. The problem is that you don't really have a good sense of what the easy games are and what the bad games are. Because essentially what you're doing is you're going off what happened last year. You tend to be going off last year's standings. And there's there's not a great correlation between the good teams last year and the good teams this year. In other sports, it might be a little bit easier, but in the NFL, the good teams and the bad teams change every year. But as I said in the first segment, in between rants about this ridiculous 3-hour event, there are a couple you can guess. Seattle, probably not going to be that good this year. I mean, Seattle was a bad team last year, and they had Russell Wilson for a good chunk of the season. They did have a couple games with Geno Smith starting, but I've always felt for years that Seattle, people kind of missed that Seattle really had declined, because Seattle had those great draft classes in 2010, 2011, 2012, and that built a championship roster. And I think like people were so focused on Seattle's success that they kind of neglected how that roster had deteriorated through the years. And it got to the end, to a point where I felt like it was really Russell Wilson was kind of like, it was almost like Russell Wilson was drafted in 2012, and it almost got to the point where he was kind of like the guy who was drafted first that year, Andrew Luck, where he was covering for a lot of deficiencies on the roster that people weren't noticing. And I think this is the year, last year things fell apart for Seattle. I think this is the year things really fall apart for Seattle, because without Russell Wilson, that team's going nowhere. So you could guess Seattle probably not going to be that great. You can guess Buffalo probably going to be really good unless there's an injury. And there could be an injury. You never know. But you can guess Buffalo's going to be pretty good. Green Bay, if they have Aaron Rodgers, they'll probably be pretty good. So you can guess a little bit. I mean, some of these other games, though, I mean, if you want to tell me Miami's going to be good or bad, you're guessing there. Jacksonville, who knows, with Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence year 2, you'd guess they'd be bad, but it wouldn't be shocking to see them take a step forward. So keep this in mind. But generally speaking, to the extent you can figure out who the easy games are and who the hard games are, and people disagree with this. I'm surprised how many people disagree with this. I'd much rather have the easy games up front. And there are a couple reasons for this. So I'm thinking Seattle. And I don't know who else I'm thinking, but you want the easy games up front, because you want to get on a little roll at the beginning of the season. And I think sometimes people view your results in the season as preordained, but I don't think so. I think sometimes if you win a couple games early, the confidence level grows. You build momentum. Guys start to feel good about things. And we've seen it through the years. We've seen it a lot in recent years, especially with the Jets. Sometimes when you get off to a slow start, things just snowball on you. You can't. You just feel like you can't get out of your own way, and the season really falls apart from that point. I mean, I always wondered that. We all remember the 2015 season where the Jets went 10-6. The next year things fell apart, and they lost this horrible game to Cincinnati in the opener. And I've always wondered, like, would that season have gone the same way if they had beaten Cincinnati? Now, they did beat Buffalo the next week 2, to get to 1-1, but I always wondered, like, how different that season may have gone had they not lost that opener to Cincinnati back in 2016. And maybe things would have gone the exact same way, but it just felt like that team, things kind of got behind the 8 ball, and that was it. And that was that. So to the extent there are easy games on the schedule, I'd like to have them front loaded, because it gives you a chance to get off to a good start. It gives you a chance to feel good about yourself. It gives, especially a young team, where confidence levels could vary. And we saw last year how the Jets got off to all these slow starts in the first quarter, and things just kind of snowballed on them within games. I'm talking about between games. I'd like to see the Jets go off to a good start. And the other aspect of this is, if you have the tough games at the back of your schedule. And I know like the counter to this is, well, when you're making the playoff push, you want easy games in December. I understand the counter, but you have to be in the playoff mix. You have to be in the playoff race. So you get to the playoff race by winning games early. But late in the season, things get very fluky because you have injuries. And you have maybe a team that, didn't live up to expectations, and maybe maybe they were a team you were expected to be pretty decent, but they have a bunch of injuries and they've kind of fallen out of the race. So maybe their guys aren't rushing back to get back on the field. And I think that ultimately, if you built confidence through the year, you're going to turn into a good team. There's, Charles Barkley, who's a TNT analyst, a great basketball player. He once said that in the early part of the season, the bad teams don't know that they're bad. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You may not have the most talented team, but if you get on a roll and you move things in the right direction, it can make a big difference. I've seen that happen plenty of times in the NFL. And on the same note, and this is, again, one that I don't know if there's any data behind it, I always like having as late as possible, the bye, just because you hear from players all the time how banged up they are at the end of the season. It's a grind, the NFL, and they've added an extra week, so now it's an 18-game regular season. It's a physical sport. They say like everybody's playing hurt by the end of the year. So to me, if you can get as late of a bye as possible, that's a benefit to you because it at least gives you a chance to rest up for the stretch run. Now, there is a counter to this that I think is kind of compelling. And you won't know in advance, but there are teams who really do benefit from an early bye. And that's if like you have a bunch of key players suffer short-term injuries at the beginning of the season. This actually happened to the Jets back in 2015, where they had an early bye because they had a London game against Miami. And heading into their bye, they had a bunch of key players injured. I remember Eric Decker was hurt, Chris Ivory was hurt. And that bye came at the perfect time for them because those guys were able to get healthy and they were able to, they were pretty much back to 100% in October. And the Jets, again, went on to have that 10-6 season. So, there's always a case where you benefit from having an early bye, but, you don't bank on having a bunch of key players having short-term injuries. And I think in general, you want the team as fresh as possible for the stretch run. Back in the Rex Ryan days, the Jets were always horrible coming out of the bye, but I always thought Rex now there were some games that were horrific that he deserved blame for, but I remember Rex said something to the effect of, the reason we come out of a bye slow is I give my guys extra days off. And I understand it's going to hurt them the first game we come back, but it's going to benefit us from the long run because the hits, all the physicality, it adds up over the course of the season. So we're adding less mileage to the odometer. So with that in mind, I think, you want the bye as late as possible to give those guys that extra rest, that extra boost for the stretch run. But there are some other things that I think could impact the Jets this season, at least marginally, where certain games are scheduled, where certain road trips fall. And I'll tell you more about that as we conclude this Thursday episode of Locked On Jets. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Now, unfortunately, they did not have a prop bet on over/under NFL Network schedule special. If they had a prop bet for 2.5 hours and you bet 3, you would have won. If they had a prop bet on would this be the most ridiculous thing they've ever done, you very well may have won because we have a 3-hour special tonight. But BetOnline has you covered. You can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, and even next season's NFL future. So the games that will be announced over this 3-hour special tonight, you'll find out about. You have a chance to bet on. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday, and I guess I should calm down because maybe the only thing more ridiculous than a 3-hour special on the schedule is somebody going on for 25 minutes complaining about the 3-hour special, but that's where we are today. But we are talking about the NFL schedule release and some things I look for every year in the Jets schedule. Now, I think the point where certain games are scheduled can have an impact. So I always like to avoid the Miami trip early season because in September it's still really hot in Florida, and even early October it can be exhausting. It's always funny because like late in the season, you always talk about the warm weather teams going to cold weather venues, but you don't hear as much about the teams that have to go to the really humid parts of the country, the really hot and humid parts of the country in September, when it's still pretty much the middle of summer. And that trip to Miami could be a really tough one if you have it the first couple weeks of the season, because again, it's really hot. Guys aren't really used to those conditions. The Dolphins are, though, when you play down there. So it can be tough, and you'll see guys get dehydrated. You'll see guys have cramps because they're just not used to those. They're just not ready physically for those conditions. And it's also early in the season, so they're not really in. Sometimes they're not completely in football shape. So that Miami game, the Jets will have to go to Miami at some point in the year. You hope it's later in the season. You don't like it to be early. And conversely, whenever you're playing a Florida team or a Dome team, I think you want that game as late in the season as possible. Does it make a big difference? Probably not, but you want people in conditions they're not used to. I can tell you, when you're in warm weather and you have to go to a cold weather venue in the winter, it's tough. It's really tough. So that's another thing I think you have to look for. Beyond that, I look for certain things in primetime games. You like to avoid short weeks. Now, there's one short week you have to do because everybody has to play a Thursday night game. I guess that's like the reason Thursday night football exists. I kind of feel like is, well, first of all, to make money, but second of all, it gives the league a chance to put every team in primetime. Every team's fan gets to see their team in primetime. You want to have that game at home because it's a short week already. I mean, it's really tough. All the feedback I've heard is that it's really tough to prepare for Thursday night games. And it's even more difficult when you have to travel on the road. You essentially can't prepare for you can't really install a game plan for a Thursday night game if you're on the road because you're flying out on Wednesday night. So your Wednesday becomes a travel day. At least you have more of a chance. I think it's a big advantage to have a Thursday night game at home. And the league has done it in recent years. The league has kind of cut down on the really, really long trips for Thursday night games. We all remember that ridiculous Tebow game where the Jets had to fly out to Denver after playing on Sunday night and they had to have this long trip, all the way to the mountain time zone. They've tried to cut down on those, but it's still really tough. So I think you'd rather have the Thursday night game at home. And I think you also want an early season for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. It's near the end of the season, your players are really beaten up, and you don't want to have them put on a short week. And I understand you do get the extra couple days after that game to prepare for your next game, but it just seems like it's a lot to put on those players to have a late season Thursday night game. On the same note, you don't want any road trips after a Monday night game. Again, short week, so you don't want to add in the factor of traveling. If you play on Monday night, you want the game to be at home because that way with all of the compressed time, you don't want to have to add in the travel aspect and also the physical toll of going on the road after that. So that's another thing to look for. And I think you also want to avoid back-to-back long road trips. And this year, the Jets don't have a ton of long road trips, but they do have trip to Seattle, trip to Denver. I think you'd like to avoid those coming back-to-back weeks just because travel can be tough. Again, these are things that are not nearly as important as matchups, as talent, as luck, but they do matter to a certain extent. Not to the extent that we needed a 3-hour special tonight, but to a certain extent. Anyway, that's all for our show today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoyed the show, subscribe to it. Leave it a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source and a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow after the special, and we'll talk about how the Jets' schedule turned out.